If there was one country no one ever expected to hear mentioned during the Nuremberg trials in 1946, when Nazi leaders and the architects behind the final solution were prosecuted, it was Switzerland. But when the Reich Minister of Economic Affairs and Hitler's personal financial advisor, Walther Funk, was asked to explain how he managed to fund the Nazi war effort, part of his reply sounded like an indictment.
It was very difficult to pay in gold. The other countries with which we still had business relations introduced gold embargoes. Only in Switzerland could we still do business through changing gold into foreign currency.
Re-examining World War II from an economic angle reveals, for the first time ever, how Switzerland was central to the Third Reich's finances. What exactly was Switzerland's role in World War II? Did the Swiss Central Bank help fund the Third Reich by buying large quantities of gold? Rarely has a topic ever been so closely documented. Rarely have the archives of the events ever been so well researched. But the story remains largely unknown. As early as 1943, Anthony Eden, head of the British Foreign Office, leveled a serious accusation at Switzerland.
Every franc's worth of war material sent by Switzerland to Germany prolongs the war.
The Third Reich would not have survived after 1943-44 without the gold laundering machine and willingness of the Swiss National Bank and others to handle looted assets for the Third Reich.
Was Switzerland really a small, neutral country surrounded on all sides, as it is believed?
If you look at the map of Europe in 1942, it's an extraordinary dominance of the Nazi regime and its allies. And in the center of that vast empire, there is this tiny island of neutrality, Switzerland. And it poses the mysterious question of why Switzerland is not conquered.
Did Switzerland use its economy as a weapon in order to maintain peace? Did the country really serve as Nazi Germany's banker? It was in a battered economy that Hitler rose to power. The reparations imposed by the Allied powers during the Treaty of Versailles at the end of World War I and the economic crisis of 1929 had crippled the German economy.
Well, the fundamentals of Germany's situation in 1933 are desperate. Germany has effectively left the gold standard. It has exchange controls. It's hugely uncompetitive against Britain and the many other countries which have devalued since 1931. It has vast unemployment. 6 million people at least are registered as unemployed and millions more working short time. So it's very clear that from 1933 onwards, Hitler has two priorities. One is an immediate restarting of the German economy, and second, and even more important and far more strategic in the long run, is rearmament.
Here, in utmost secrecy, the hardening up process, building up Hitler's army and his industry.
And both of these policies face an immediate obstacle, and it's the obstacle that had already haunted the Weimar Republic. It is basically the shortage of foreign exchange. And this is so crucial because as Germany industry starts producing again, it sucks in raw materials. And those raw materials come from abroad and they have to be paid for with foreign exchange.
Germany was rich in coal, but had no other resources at its disposal. The country relied heavily on imports for its tremendous armament effort. Germany's rearmament policy accounted for more than half of public spending beginning in the early 1930s and was draining the Reichsbank's gold and foreign currency reserves.
So Germany is a vulnerable economy. It is financially under pressure. It's a society which is constantly anxious about where it is going to get the foreign reserves, the gold that are necessary to pay for crucial imports.
From an economic standpoint, the invasion and incorporation of Austria into Nazi Germany in March of 1938 and Austria's billion in gold and foreign currency that fell under German control provided a temporary respite for the Reichsbank's reserves. The strain of importing raw materials took a toll on the German economy and was evident in a series of events carried out by the Third Reich. The tragic Kristallnacht, or Crystal Night, was carried out in November of 1938, a pogrom during which nearly 100 Jews were murdered, tens of thousands deported, 191 synagogues burned, and thousands of Jewish shops and businesses pillaged.
This cataclysmic event in the history of Europe indicate that this regime will stop at nothing, respects no law, refuses the standards of Western civilization. 3 days after, Goering presides over a meeting on the 12th of November, at which, believe it or not, the main subject of discussion is the financial cost in foreign exchange terms of the broken glass. And he expostulates that he would rather have seen hundreds of Jews killed than this amount of money wasted in the breaking of fancy imported Belgian plate glass.
After Hitler's rise to power, Hjalmar Schacht, who served as president of the Reichsbank and Minister of Economics, introduced a plan to make Germany an economic autarky. A vast manufacturing program for synthetic materials, rubber, textiles, fuel, was implemented. Despite efforts, raw material imports were deepening the deficit. In 1939, the billion in gold and foreign currency reserves seized by the Third Reich in the invasion of Austria was depleted in just a few months' time. Germany found itself once again in an unsustainable financial situation. Hjalmar Schacht notified the Führer.
The infamous memorandum that the Reichsbank president at the time, Hjalmar Schacht, sent to Hitler on January the 7th, 1939, essentially said, "We're bankrupt and about to default on payments." The Reichsbank was on the verge of collapse. It called for a radical change of policy.
So the Reichsbank at this moment is lobbying Hitler by way of the question of finance to change the entire direction of his regime under the pressure of economic necessity. Hitler's response is unambiguous. Schacht is retired with honor to a position as a minister without portfolio.
The start of World War II can be regarded as a plundering campaign, pure and simple.
Hitler launched a blitzkrieg, or lightning war. It was the only viable conquering strategy for an army on a mission to acquire the resources that were so severely lacking. In 1939, German forces were highly vulnerable, with only enough ammunition reserves to last 2 weeks of combat.
So, as the German army invades the Netherlands, as it invades Belgium, as it invades France, Denmark, the central bank is one of the key targets. And squads of German experts are employed to rifle through the accounts and the lockers and the closed bank vaults of Europe to find all precious metals or reserves or jewelry or private assets that can be seized by the Nazi economy and used as purchasing power for much-needed raw materials.
In central banks across Europe, Nazi Germany seized 83 tons of Austrian gold, 3.5 tons of Czech gold, 132 tons of Dutch gold, 4 tons from Luxembourg, 180 tons from Belgium. Then in 1943, following the fall of Mussolini, 65 tons of Italian and Albanian gold.
World War II certainly sees the most organised efforts at looting we've ever seen in military history.
But it did not stop there. The gold then had to be traded to acquire the much-needed raw materials. Where could the Third Reich exchange the gold unbeknown to the Allies? World War II was also an economic war. In an attempt to isolate the Axis powers early on, the Allies imposed a blockade, one that both restricted German imports of raw materials and controlled currency, with tight limits on foreign exchange with the British pound and American dollar.
À ce moment-là, le franc suisse était la seule devise que l'Allemagne pouvait utiliser librement sur des marchés qui n'étaient pas sous contrôle de l'Axe, donc de l'Allemagne. Dans ce contexte, les services que la Suisse a pu offrir en acceptant l'or de l'Allemagne pour l'échanger en francs suisses étaient très précieux pour l'Allemagne. Et quand on regarde un peu les statistiques, on voit que 4/5 de l'or que la Reichsbank a vendu pendant la guerre a été placé ou a été accepté par la Banque nationale suisse.
As the Wehrmacht gradually conquered two-thirds of Europe, there was a certain amount of gold stamped Reichsbank that began to turn up, which was obviously very fishy. It soon became obvious that there were gold reserves coming from Germany that hadn't been there before the war, which immediately stirred suspicions, and every central bank director knew that.
Jean-Pierre Roth was the central banker for Switzerland for 15 years. As chairman of the Swiss National Bank in the late 1990s, he had to understand and explain the institution's behavior in the dark days of war.
There was question as to what the German gold reserves had been before the war. And one approach was to say that, as long as the shipments remained within the limits of what were assumed to be the Reichsbank's reserves before the war, it wouldn't be an issue. Questions were being raised, but no one went as far as to analyze the legality of it. And one of the major criticisms that was made in retrospect is that not enough questions had been asked. It had supposedly been done in good faith, meaning they took their word for it. The bankers at the Swiss National Bank weren't stupid. They were generally extremely cautious. They never asked for certificates of origin for the looted gold. Alfred Hirsch, Director General of the Bank of Switzerland, even said, "We never asked. Puhl's word was enough."
Emile Puhl had worked at the Reichsbank since World War I. In the eyes of Europe, the director and the vice president of the institution embodied the German central bank's policies.
Representatives of the Reichsbank had been in contact with the SNB before the war. Relations had already been established. There was normal communication and trust. Today, between central bankers, there's great trust. There's open communication and information gets exchanged. And so some must have thought, why would a Reichsbank representative lie to me now? I trust him. If he says the German gold reserves are enough to cover all incoming deliveries, why shouldn't I believe that he is telling the truth?
The underground stacks that cover 7 floors of the Swiss Federal Archives, much like the archives of the Swiss National Bank, were combed through by historian Marc Perrenot. The minutes from meetings held between Swiss National Bank directors led the researcher to make a surprising revelation. The highest-ranking officials at the SNB were willing to use deceptive methods.
Throughout 1942, there was information that reached Switzerland regarding the dubious transactions that had been made by the Reichsbank, which caught the attention of Swiss diplomats, and also the governing board of the SNB. One of the general directors even proposed remelting the gold bars sold by the Reichsbank to erase any trace of their actual origin.
Discussed at length, the proposal to melt the gold bars that had come from Germany to erase any trace of their origin was postponed by the governing board in order to further assess the potential risks.
They didn't do it.
They didn't. They were waiting.
They didn't do it. That never happened. They wondered if it wouldn't cause problems down the road, and so it was never done. Let me be clear. Things would have been extremely serious had such maneuvers actually been carried out, but they weren't.
How did the Reichsbank in Berlin perceive the role of the Swiss banks? Like that of a key partner, as evidenced by an internal report written in June of 1943, in which Walther Funk, the Reich Minister of Economics and President of the Central Bank, declared,
"If Switzerland stopped exchanging hard currency for its gold, we could not hold out for more than 2 months."
Ever since the first deliveries of 20 tons of gold in 1940, shipments sent by the Reichsbank to the Swiss National Bank's vaults rapidly increased year to year, and peaked in 1943 when 120 tons of gold arrived from Berlin. In total, nearly 345 tons of gold were added to the SNB's vaults in Bern during World War II. Why did Germany so desperately need Swiss francs? Was the plunder of occupied countries not enough? Why did Germany insist on trading with neutral countries, importing petrol from Romania, iron from Sweden, and chromium from Turkey? The answer to such questions can be found at the bottom of a secluded valley in the north of Portugal, in Rio de Frades, deep in an old tungsten mine that was operated by the Third Reich throughout the war.
Tungsten is a metal. Its main properties include a resistance to very high temperatures and corrosion. Following the invasion of the Soviet Union, Germany could only depend on Portugal and Spain to supply tungsten. Without tungsten, Germany would have had to shut down its arms and ammunitions manufacturing. You cannot make an aircraft engine if you do not have tungsten, which can resist temperatures as high as 6,000 degrees. When a dive bomber is plunging, the engine reaches temperatures of a few thousand degrees. Tungsten ensures that your engine won't explode, and the same goes for engine oil. Without these tiny but key parts, your war machine won't work, literally speaking. And that's where the Swiss National Bank played a very important role. When you consider the contributions made by Swiss leaders in the German war effort, it isn't necessarily a matter of quantity, but quality.
Under pressure from the Allies, the neutral European countries that had been supplying Germany with raw materials refused to be paid in stolen gold. The example of Portuguese tungsten reveals a sophisticated trading system that emerged with Switzerland's help, otherwise known as triangular trading.
So what did the Reichsbank do? It turned to the Swiss banks early in the war to trade gold for Swiss francs. The Reichsbank then used those Swiss francs to pay its Portuguese suppliers. And then the Bank of Portugal presented those Swiss francs to the SNB to convert them back into gold. Gold wasn't sent to Lisbon from one day to the next. It was moved within the Swiss National Bank's vaults. The gold bars were simply moved to the vault belonging to the Portuguese treasury.
Through the triangular trading system, the Swiss francs that left Bern eventually returned, but the gold that entered the Swiss vaults usually stayed there.
Mais encore une fois, les responsables suisses ne s'occupaient quand même pas trop de cette question, tout simplement en justifiant l'acceptation de cet or par le droit international. On disait en interprétant le droit international de sorte que celui-ci permet aux vainqueurs dans des guerres de mettre la main sur les stocks d'or de la Banque centrale des pays occupés.
The rise of the Swiss National Bank specifically shed light on discussions between central bank governing board members and on how much they knew. Gottlieb Bachmann was then president of the bank committee, and Paul Rossi, the vice president responsible for gold transactions. The meeting minutes from August of 1943 contained the following exchange.
Two questions should be distinguished. First, do we want to accept the gold? And second, without further examination, can we accept the gold, even though there may be suspicions as to whether it was obtained illegally?
The National Bank has yet to receive any information that would suggest the Germans have stolen gold. The requisition of monetary gold is within the right of the conqueror nation under international law.
So it was a stance that suggests that they didn't realize the break with normality that the Nazi regime implied. It was no longer possible to do business with the central bankers who had been appointed by Hitler, in the same way as with the central bankers of other democratic states. I am neutral, therefore I must do business with Germany, as I do with the Allies. It was almost inevitable. We cannot refuse German gold if we accept gold from the Allies, because we are neutral.
They didn't give it any further thought. They conducted transactions, which is what capitalism calls for. That's doing business in normal circumstances. That is a firm's reason for being, and that's what makes it a good capitalist. That is, its moral duty. So what does a firm do in normal circumstances? It seizes opportunities as they're presented without asking questions.
Bien, sans se poser de questions.
When the Allies landed on the beaches of Normandy in June of 1944, the end of the war was inevitable. It was only a question of when and the conditions of the Allied forces' victory. Throwing caution to the wind, the Swiss National Bank continued to do business with the Reichsbank. But as early as 1942, the Allies had begun to track Swiss activities. They repeatedly called for the Swiss Confederation to cease any and all purchases of German gold. Switzerland stalled. It wasn't until March 8, 1945, only a few weeks before Adolf Hitler committed suicide, that Swiss authorities signed the Curry Mission Agreement with the Allies in Bern, by which Switzerland agreed to halt gold purchases from Germany. But 1 month after the agreement had been signed, a new purchase of gold was made. On April 13, 1945, 132 gold bars left the Reichsbank in Constance for the Swiss vaults in Bern.
Everyone knew that Switzerland, specifically the National Bank and the Swiss government, would have to be held accountable. And yet, despite the political agreement that Switzerland had signed only 1 month earlier, they proceeded to make one last purchase, which paid back a certain number of depositors who feared losses. It's hard to say why. I don't know why. There's really no answer.
The Reichsbank could count on the Swiss National Bank until the final hours of the Nazi regime. As American, British, and Soviet bombs rained down on Berlin, Emil Pohl, returning from a stay in Switzerland, wrote to his superior, Walther Funk.
I can say that the Swiss have shown me every possible courtesy. Yesterday, for example, they held a banquet in my honor. Naturally, our enemies immediately caught wind of it.
Switzerland wasn't destroyed. If that made it a good deal, so be it. The country was not destroyed. Considering the footage that was taken of countries like France, Germany, and Italy at the end of the war, it becomes very clear that Switzerland was very fortunate to have come out of it unscathed. The war and the procession of tragedies it has brought have spared our country. Sunday has not lost its charms. We go on excursions. We attend sporting events. Our youth are in fine health. Our fields and gardens have not been ruined. Our herds are intact. Our towns lead a peaceful existence.
People would often refer to one of Bertolt Brecht's old jokes back then. I think it went something like, Hitler has no interest in attacking Switzerland. Why attack your own vault?
Occupying Switzerland was unattractive to the Nazi regime, not only because a military operation in the Alps is a formidable proposition, but also because Switzerland was extremely useful to the Nazi regime as a neutral entrepot, as an island of neutrality at the heart of a Nazi empire. Harmless but useful.
Swiss bankers exchanged nearly 500 tons of Nazi gold throughout the war. In today's terms, that is equivalent to 60 billion euros. What place would Switzerland occupy for the victorious powers immediately following the war? The Allies formally invited a Swiss delegation to Washington in 1946 to be held accountable for Switzerland's questionable behavior during the war. 68 days of tough negotiations led to an unexpected outcome.
Switzerland actually got off
un paiement de 250 millions de francs en or. Ça correspondait à l'époque, en 1946, à 1,5% du produit intérieur brut, ou même moins. Donc, c'était une petite amende. Et puis voilà, les affaires étaient réglées.
What was crucial from the Swiss standpoint is that the Swiss delegation obtained a full and final settlement. It's important to remember that at this point in time, the Dutch had not yet made an inquiry to reclaim their gold. After negotiations had ended, the Netherlands said, hey, a considerable portion of Dutch gold reserves was also stolen. We want the case reopened. And the Swiss could reply, legally, the case is closed. So from the Swiss standpoint, the agreement was obviously considered to be advantageous. Officially, they would say, this is awful. Those awful Americans have us by the throat. They want to wring our necks. But unofficially, they acknowledged that the agreement had been extremely advantageous for Switzerland, who had gotten off very lightly.
If there was one place where the Swiss delegation's satisfaction was evident, it was in a report the Swiss embassy in Washington addressed to its minister.
that a small country with a population of 4 million could have succeeded in the face of 3 major powers, making them reduce a very considerable portion of their demands is almost a diplomatic miracle in my eyes.
The fine was small. Switzerland had negotiated well. But there still was a fine. I do think that our diplomats were extremely good.
The Iron Curtain soon fell in the middle of Europe, and Zurich's financial centre soon became a key ally for Western investors once again. And so Switzerland, or more precisely Swiss bankers, had another incredible opportunity to escape the punishment they so very much deserved.
Like many European countries, post-war Switzerland wrote a glorified, legendary history, one of heroic resistance to the Nazi regime, of a safe haven for refugees, and of irreproachable neutrality. For many years, Switzerland could bury its secrets. "50 years after the miracle in Washington, it was almost by accident that the true history of Nazi gold laundered by the SNB resurfaced in the mid-1990s during a heated political dispute between the United States and Switzerland, the dormant accounts controversy.
There were accounts that had been opened in Swiss banks and insurance companies by people hoping to flee the Nazis, or who were themselves victims of the Nazi genocide. Many of them did not survive, and so those assets remained in the bank and insurance accounts.
The banks came to an agreement to take a common position. They agreed that legitimate heirs and beneficiaries, in order to claim dormant accounts at the teller counter, would be required to present the official death certificate of the deceased account holder and papers proving they were indeed the designated beneficiaries. For someone who died in Dachau or in any other extermination camp, the Nazis never signed an official death certificate.
Asking for the death certificate of someone who was murdered in an extermination camp is something that lacks sensitivity and common sense.
In 1996, the World Jewish Congress took up the issue and urged the few remaining survivors and descendants of Holocaust victims to come forward, calling it one of the biggest financial scandals in history.
Where is it? Please.
The issue took a political turn when New York Senator and Chairman of the Senate Banking Committee, Alphonse D'Amato, became involved, and when the Clinton administration declassified the American archives dating back to World War II.
This is not about retribution. This is about justice.
Greg Rickman was Alphonse D'Amato's right-hand man and conducted historical research for the senator. He was reviled by the Swiss. He still clearly recalls the deep contempt Swiss bankers and the Swiss authorities showed.
It was this view that there's nobody alive, that there couldn't have been that much money there. And as we later found out, they had a view that whatever money was there was war booty. This was ours. No one came back to claim it. Why shouldn't we get to keep it?
A gaffe made by the chairman of Switzerland's largest bank, UBS, was a telling indicator of the Swiss leader's state of mind.
10.5 million. That's 10.5 million Swiss francs of today. That's the interest on interest on interest. I think it's safe to say we're only talking about peanuts.
He used the term peanuts. The remark made its way around the world in a matter of seconds. It stirred the hornet's nest because Jewish groups were deeply shocked. They felt insulted by the bank's chairman.
In the face of a fierce American campaign, Swiss authorities and Swiss bankers made repeated blunders. Even attempts to do good backfired.
Then these are the listings from the New York Times of the names of the accounts that they found after they were listed by the Swiss banks.
Under pressure from the United States, the Swiss Banking Association spent $5 million on newspaper advertisements in 28 countries to publish a list of dormant account holders. The news came as a bombshell, but for some very unexpected reasons.
The list contained the names of 1,862 people. But the Swiss authorities had forgotten to filter it before it was published. And a large number of Nazis and Nazi sympathizers, Kaltenbrunner, Tucker, Bauer, were on that list.
So you had names like Willy Bauer, an alias used by Anton Berger, who was an aide to Adolf Eichmann. Elizabeth Ader, who was a wife of Ernst Kaltenbrunner, who was a high Nazi official. These were major Nazis, either war criminals or high Nazi officials that had Swiss bank accounts. It was an attempt to do a good thing, and that didn't even turn out right for them.
Publishing a list of names of dormant account holders would also have another serious consequence for the Swiss. Madeleine Kunin, former governor of Vermont, was at the center of the new development.
Well, I was born in Switzerland, in Zurich, and we left Switzerland because of World War II in 1940 when I was 6½. And then when I became ambassador, when Bill Clinton appointed me ambassador to Switzerland, it was like my life had come full circle. You know, one morning I was in my office and I was looking at the newspaper and scanning the list. There was my mother's name, Renee May, and I was shocked.
If you talk about things that Swiss did wrong, I wouldn't say that they did this wrong, but it was certainly worked against them, and they couldn't have possibly realized that the ambassador from the country chiefly accusing them of misdeeds would herself find her name on the list.
Well, I shared it with my brother, and came out to like $100 each, because you know the Swiss bank, instead of paying interest where you earn money on an account, they charge fees for holding the account. I suspect it was never very large, but it probably was larger than what was left at that time. It's a strange way to do banking, but it seems to work, for the Swiss anyway.
In order to force Swiss bankers and institutions to finally take action on unclaimed assets, the United States searched the archives for compromising information, putting together pieces of the Swiss collective memory that had been forgotten for 50 years. The issue of the Swiss National Bank purchasing Nazi gold inevitably resurfaced.
We have documents confirming that the Swiss were actively and directly involved in shipping gold for Nazis. These documents show that the Swiss claim of neutrality in World War II was pure nonsense.
As this document said, that two-thirds of all German gold shipments abroad during the war were destined for the Swiss National Bank. The only thing you can conclude from looking at these documents was that they prolonged the war because it was their outlet, and they provided the sources of the money back to them to keep the war machine running. If they didn't have a place to do their banking, they couldn't have paid for the war.
Switzerland prolonged the war. The assertion is still widely debated today.
On peut s'imaginer que dans des moments difficiles, avec un boycott de la Suisse, on aurait probablement pu perturber certains secteurs technologiques hautement spécialisés de la production allemande. Mais la question de savoir si cette perturbation aurait vraiment raccourci la guerre, ça c'est une pure spéculation.
I have no idea. How could anyone know? It's hard to discuss hypothetical history, isn't it?
if it was 6 months, if it was 1 month, if it was 1 day, how many people died all over the world, all over Europe, because they had financing.
Et millions d'hommes supplémentaires.
Millions more most likely died because of the conscious acts of those who took the looted property and laundered stolen gold in Switzerland.
Volé de la Suisse.
On May 7, 1997, the accusations made by the Clinton administration sent shockwaves around the world. The people of Switzerland were shaken, bewildered, and outraged. They no longer knew what story to believe.
At some point, it became necessary for the Swiss authorities to start providing answers that would be more substantial. They could no longer just call it ancient history. In what was essentially a crisis, the government appointed historians to start providing some answers, hoping that would calm things down.
Until the end of last year, Jean-François Berger was a history professor like any other. Just a few days after being appointed chair of the prestigious International Commission of Experts charged with revisiting the history of Switzerland, the Vaud native who teaches in Zurich has drawn attention and expectations are high. He's charged with the onerous task of reconciling the Swiss with recent history. He has also become a veritable player on the political scene.
The authorities set up the commission and made the key decision to give historians the means to properly do their job. And when I say means, I'm referring to the fact that the Swiss Federal Council made the decision to give historians access to the archives of private firms, including banks, in Switzerland for 5 years. This meant a lift on banking secrecy for 5 years. It began to provide some answers, but those answers tended to confirm that there was a lot more to say. There were also a certain number of things that could be criticized.
There were a series of revelations across the board. The activities of private firms and banks during World War II, the Swiss Army's belittling role in the face of the Nazis, as well as the refugee policies once considered irreproachable. But yet again, the Swiss National Bank's handling of Nazi gold brought forth one of the most horrifying revelations of all.
That gold that made it into the Swiss National Bank, some percentage of it, perhaps as many as 6 bars, perhaps as few as 3, as Berger had found, had comprised dental gold taken from concentration camp victims in southern Poland, in Auschwitz, and near Lublin, which would be Majdanek, and resmelted in Berlin at the Reichsbank and sent down to the Swiss National Bank.
We cannot deny not only the possibility, but the fact that the gold taken from the Jews who died in the concentration camps, even if it was only a marginal amount, did in fact arrive in Switzerland and did ultimately find refuge, so to speak, in the Swiss National Bank's vaults.
In parallel with the Berger Commission, the Swiss Parliament voted a law banning the destruction of archives, public or private, related to World War II. Christoph Mehly, then a young man working as a night watchman at the Union Bank of Switzerland, the powerful UBS, would spark a new controversy. The hypocrisy of Swiss officials would again come to light. The security employee has become a whistleblower. Last week, while doing his rounds at the UBS location in Bahnhofstrasse, he found accounting records in a room reserved for the shredding of official documents.
There were some thick binders, among other books and papers, dating back to the 1930s through 1940, which listed real estate records for Berlin property. I knew that those documents should not be shredded. They should have been submitted to the Commission of Experts. After the press conference in Zurich, I went back home, and there were television cameras waiting for me at my doorstep. And the postman had come to deliver my termination letter. And then the telephone started ringing in the living room. It was a call from Washington, D.C., from the U.S. Senate Banking Committee. And Mr. D'Amato was inviting me to the United States to talk about what I had seen.
Christophe Mély is a hero, not a criminal, ardently asserted the senator. But a judicial investigation was opened against him for a violation of banking secrecy. The UBS employee who ordered the documents be shredded was not charged.
After he disclosed those documents, he was accused of violating bank secrecy by UBS and essentially theft, which is funny in as much as those documents were to be shredded, which would have done essentially the same thing.
At the time, and even today, people say, Mély is with the Jews. Mély has been bought by the Jews. Mély is being paid by the Jews. I can only imagine the persecution the Jewish people must have experienced back then. The U.S. Congress passed a bill which was then signed by President Bill Clinton, and I became the first Swiss citizen to be granted political asylum in America.
Christophe Mély became a pariah in his own country, but a hero in the United States. Like a game of chess, the United States was determined to pin Switzerland by targeting its most sensitive points, the country's industrial flagships and its banks.
Suddenly, the threat of boycott really threatened to tarnish their reputation. And a bank has to have a clean reputation for people to put their money there and invest for them. So I think it was the hot spot that got everybody's attention.
It indeed came to an end through an agreement, one in which Swiss banks certainly paid more than they owed, I would say. But I don't feel bad for them. They made their fair share of mistakes. It was a valuable lesson, as they say. The banks paid dearly, much more than they probably would have if things had unfolded normally.
I am tremendously pleased and gratified to announce that we've reached an historic agreement with the Swiss banks that will bring moral and material justice to those who have suffered for so long. The agreement calls for a settlement of $1,250 million.
If you think of the likely cumulative interest over the past 50 years, it's a ridiculous amount. But it was a way for Swiss bankers to get off very, very likely a second time.
After a period of close interest in its history, and after 3 years of revelations and attacks, the Swiss Commission of Experts, led by Professor Bergier, finally published its 11,000-page report, providing a thorough look at Swiss history during World War II. The majority of Switzerland had reached a breaking point. Swiss economist Jean-Christophe Lambelet is a staunch defender of the country's heroic history.
We created the movement, a task force for the true history of Switzerland, to push back against what were considered to be misguided and often malicious attacks, which have led to the current political landscape and which have tarnished the image of Switzerland. What do you do if you're next to a country of 80 million? According to the 1940 census, Germany already had a population of 80 million. Switzerland only had a population of 4 million, lacked raw materials, and only produced half of the food needed to feed the country. You do what you've got to do.
The incoming calls for the moment have absolutely all been going in the same direction. Viewers are extremely critical of the Commission's work. Some harsh words have been used. The Bergier Commission has been criticised for failing to take into account the context at the time. The Bergier report doesn't show the whole picture. It has also been said that other countries did far worse than Switzerland, which should not take the blame.
Listen, there is an affluent majority in Switzerland, about 2/3, that shares that philosophy and those views.
Many had the impression that they were being stripped of their memories, of their pride, and the feeling of resistance that Switzerland had. The Swiss were very proud of the fact that Hitler allegedly called Switzerland the little hedgehog. That was Switzerland's role, that of a tiny little animal. Though not very powerful, it can keep the predator at bay with its spines.
After years of meticulous archival research, after months of crisis, controversy, and national catastrophe, the case was closed once again, leaving little trace behind in Switzerland today.
How many times do we open the newspapers and we read of another Swiss bank being brought to bear before the US government and being fined for doing something wrong or aiding an arms dealer or illicit transfers of cash? And I wonder if they've learned anything.
History helps us ask the real questions. Questions about morality in politics, and about state and societal guidelines for an economic function that, if profits are the only objective, may lead to some regrettable choices.
Switzerland is a fascinating country, one that is very complex, but one that must be liberated from its banking oligarchy. And that will happen, because an uprising in awareness in Switzerland is near.
Amen.